Can you believe that an entire civilization, one responsible for laying the very foundations of modern communication and global commerce, could be almost entirely forgotten? That the most powerful empire the world had ever seen, ruling not through conquering armies but through unimaginable wealth and impenetrable secrecy, was headquartered on a tiny, blood-soaked sliver of coastline, barely visible on the map? This is not just history. This is the true, untold story of the deep, dark Mediterranean Sea and the silent kings who mastered it, the Phoenicians. For nearly 2 millennia, while vast, land-based empires like Egypt and Babylon were preoccupied with building colossal monuments and fighting dusty border wars, a different kind of power was quietly being forged. It was a power built on cedar wood, deep-sea currents, and a secret so valuable, so essential to status and royalty, that men were willing to commit genocide just to control its source. We are talking about the ultimate luxury, the signal of divine authority and earthly supremacy, Tyrian purple. Imagine a hue so rich, so deeply saturated, that it never faded. A color derived from crushing millions upon millions of tiny sea snails, a process so arduous and stinking that the smell of money hung like a curse over their coastal cities. This dye, more precious than gold, was the lifeblood of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblus, the triumvirate of Phoenician city-states that dared to defy geography and destiny. They had no vast agricultural plains, no great standing army to protect them from the Assyrian war machine lurking just inland, yet they became richer, faster, and more globally connected than anyone else. The Phoenician secret wasn't just the dye, it was the water. They were the world's first true deep-sea navigators, the men who laughed at the terrifying notion that the ocean was merely a vast, flat expanse that ended in a waterfall of death. While others hugged the coastline, shivering in fear of storms and mythical kraken, these mariners sailed straight into the horizon, guided only by the North Star and a terrifying, innate confidence in their own shipbuilding prowess. They didn't just sail, they colonized. They didn't just trade, they created the supply chain for the entire ancient world. From their cramped harbors, they launched ships carrying the dark, aromatic cedar wood of Lebanon, shimmering glassware that dazzled Egyptian pharaohs, silver mined from lands no one else dared to visit, and of course, that intoxicating, royal purple cloth. Their influence stretched from the shores of the Levant, across the scorching sands of North Africa, all the way to the mythic, metal-rich mines of Britain, which they reached centuries before Rome even dared to dream of crossing the Channel. Can you grasp the magnitude of this achievement? A tiny collection of city-states, perpetually under threat from larger powers, somehow established a sprawling, interconnected network of trade posts, later transformed into powerful, independent colonies like Carthage that encircled the entire known world. They were the ancient world's hidden hand, the silent partners, the venture capitalists of antiquity who funded the rise and fall of kings merely by controlling the flow of goods. And then there is the greatest, most devastating secret they gifted the world, a secret that allowed armies to be organized, treaties to be written, and history itself to be recorded: the alphabet. Before the Phoenicians, writing was a cumbersome, elitist art form confined to scribes, requiring thousands of complex cuneiform wedge marks or hieroglyphic symbols. The Phoenicians, needing a fast, efficient way to record complex shipping manifests and debt ledgers across dozens of languages, stripped language down to its bare essence: 22 elegant, simple phonetic symbols. It was a revolution. This system, so brilliantly simple, was absorbed by the Greeks, passed to the Romans, and ultimately became the basis for every major written language used in the West today. They gave us the ability to write this story, yet history has rendered them practically invisible. Why? Because the very things that made them powerful, their maritime secrecy, their decentralized structure, and their lack of interest in monumental self-glorification, made them easy to erase when the true catastrophe hit. And trust me, a catastrophe no one saw coming was barreling toward them like a tidal wave. They had built their entire civilization on two dangerous pillars: the ability to always outsail their enemies and the guarantee that their incredible wealth would always buy them protection or favor. But the world was changing. The Bronze Age collapse had given way to the Iron Age, and new, hungry empires were emerging, not just interested in trade, but in total, brutal domination. The most terrifying of these were the Assyrians, a land-based scourge whose ambition was not profit but absolute submission. Their strategy was simple: besiege the walled cities, starve the population, and execute every man, woman, and child who dared resist. For the first time, the Phoenicians realized that no amount of purple dye or silver could truly protect the mainland cities of Tyre and Sidon from the relentless march of boots and iron swords. They were surrounded, squeezed between the boundless sea and the crushing ambitions of Mesopotamian kings. This is where the story shifts from triumphant dominance to desperate survival. This is the moment the true price of empire must be paid. Their very existence became a high-stakes chess game played against colossal, blood-crazed opponents, forcing them to make alliances with dangerous rivals like the Greeks and the Egyptians, all while secretly funneling their vast fortunes and their most brilliant minds across the sea, away from the impending collapse. They knew the mainland was doomed, but they had a backup plan, a final, desperate gamble, hidden on the shores of North Africa, across the Strait of Sicily, a city they had founded as a humble refueling post, but which they began to load with the accumulated wealth and knowledge of 2,000 years. That city was Carthage, the new city, and it was destined to rise as the ultimate heir to the Phoenician legacy, only to face an enemy even more terrifying than the Assyrians: the cold, unyielding ambition of Rome. You are about to witness the spectacular rise and the agonizing, millennia-long death of the world's first true global empire. They were pinned, you understand? Pinned against the treacherous, jagged spine of the Lebanon mountains, a brutal, unforgiving wall of stone that left them with almost no arable land, no vast plains for farming like their Egyptian or Mesopotamian rivals. These early Canaanites, stuck on a sliver of coast, faced a destiny of starvation. Yet they looked out at the impossible blue expanse of the Mediterranean and saw not a barrier, but the largest, most dangerous highway ever conceived. They had no choice but to master the waves, to turn scarcity into the ultimate superpower. This tiny, resource-starved land, barely 10 miles wide in most places, was a cage, and the only key was shipbuilding. A mastery born not of ambition, but of desperate necessity. Imagine being surrounded by empires that measured their wealth in thousands of miles of fertile river valley, while your entire territory was smaller than a modern American county. Survival meant abandoning the dirt entirely and placing their entire faith and their entire civilization into the chaotic, unpredictable arms of the sea god Baal. Every great power had built their kingdoms on dirt, on rivers, on grain. The Phoenicians built theirs on wood, specifically the legendary, virtually indestructible cedar of Lebanon, a timber so sacred that kings fought wars just to possess it. They didn't just build boats. They built the first true ocean-faring vessels, deep-keeled round ships capable of carrying staggering loads and narrow, swift galleys designed to outrun anything on the horizon. Their vessels were the stealth bombers of the Bronze Age, capable of sailing further, faster, and holding more wealth than any Egyptian barge or Mycenaean galley dared attempt. They became the first people in history to truly understand the relentless, shifting moods of the sea, navigating by stars and sheer, terrifying guts. They mapped the coastlines not with scrolls and charts, but with memory and a terrifying confidence that allowed them to navigate out of sight of land, a feat most sailors considered utterly suicidal. They sailed west, always west, pushing the boundaries of the known world, always silent, always secretive, carrying cargo so valuable that if just one ship sank, an entire city-state could face ruin. But how do you pay for the cedar, the sails, the crews willing to face the unknown? You need a commodity so rare, so desirable, that kings would literally murder their own families just to wear it. You need the color of the gods, the shade of pure, unattainable power, Tyrian purple. This wasn't just a dye. It was distilled authority, the deep, blood-red violet reserved exclusively for emperors and the most powerful priests. To wear this color was to declare yourself above all laws, beyond all mortal challenge, a walking demigod. The secret lay in the murex snail, harvested by the thousands in massive, reeking piles outside the city walls of Tyre and Sidon. The process of extraction was gruesome, a true testament to the deadly price of luxury. The smell was legendary, a stench so foul, so profound, that Tyrian purple manufacturers were often forced to live and work kilometers outside the main city gates. Imagine literally tens of thousands of snails crushed and left to ferment in vats under the scorching sun, releasing a smell that could choke a donkey at 50 paces. The fermenting liquid was a toxic, nauseating brew that required extreme care to manage, yet the rewards were astronomical. It took 12,000 of these tiny marine mollusks, 12,000 agonizing, shell-crushing deaths, just to produce 1 single gram of usable dye, enough to tint the edge of a small piece of cloth. This unbelievable scarcity drove the price higher than gold, making the Phoenicians the exclusive suppliers of the ancient world's most luxurious, deadly symbol. They held the monopoly on the color of divinity, and the world paid them whatever they demanded, in silver, in timber, and in silence. Their ships returned loaded with unimaginable treasures: tin from Britain, silver from Spain, copper from Cyprus, ivory and gold from Africa. They weren't just merchants. They were global supply chain managers who connected a fragmented, terrifying world. With their ships and their terrifying purple secret secured, the scattered coastal settlements solidified into legendary city-states. Bibles, the ancient gatekeeper of the papyrus trade, literally giving its name to the book itself. Sidon, the undisputed master of early glass and fine craftsmanship. And ultimately, the crown jewel, Tyre, the rocky fortress that would rule the waves. These were not sprawling land empires like Egypt. They were lean, cutthroat maritime republics, focused entirely on efficiency and profit, governed by councils of wealthy merchant princes, not divine pharaohs. They were the original venture capitalists of antiquity, seeing every interaction as a potential trade agreement, every foreign port as a market opportunity to exploit. But managing this staggering wealth required something more than just fast ships and rare dyes. It required communication that could bridge the gap between Egyptian hieroglyphs that required years of priestly training to read and Mesopotamian cuneiform that needs a chisel and a brick. They were moving too slow. The sheer volume of transactions, the tallying of silver, the counting of tin ingots, the recording of shipments of purple cloth, was overwhelming the traditional scribal systems. The Phoenicians needed a universal language of commerce, something simple, fast, and accessible to every merchant captain, every dock worker, every sailor counting barrels. They needed a tool that would revolutionize human thought itself, and they found it in 22 simple, elegant symbols derived from earlier Proto-Sinaitic scripts. They stripped away the complexity, tossed aside the pictures of birds and baskets, and left only the pure sound. The Aleph became the A, the Beth became the B. Suddenly anyone could learn to read and write in a matter of weeks, not decades. They didn't just invent trade, they invented the alphabet, the fundamental tool of modern literacy, and spread it across the known world, not as missionaries, but as ruthless businessmen. The alphabet was the Trojan horse of their silent and visible empire, binding the Mediterranean together in a way no invading army ever could. And that, my friends, is where the real danger began. Because when you control the flow of wealth and the flow of information, the great land empires will inevitably come for you, knife in hand. The land empires, bulky and slow, could only watch the sleek, deadly ships of the Phoenicians cut across the water, carrying fortunes in their holds. They didn't just sail, they owned the sea. Their control wasn't enforced by giant navies like Rome's would be, but by pure, unadulterated knowledge and the ruthless suppression of geographical information. They were the original map hoarders, treating every discovered star chart and every navigable current as state secrets punishable by a watery death. Imagine the sheer, terrifying audacity required for these narrow-strip dwellers to push past the known borders of the Mediterranean, sailing towards sunsets that promised only monsters and oblivion, all in pursuit of one thing: wealth. This wealth wasn't abstract, it was physical, embodied in the most sought-after substance in the entire ancient world, a dye so precious, so vibrant, that wearing it instantly elevated a man to godlike status. I am talking, of course, about the legendary Tyrian purple. This color, the deep, blood-red majesty of royalty, was not merely expensive. It was effectively a liquid currency, more valuable ounce for ounce than gold. And the secret to its creation was simultaneously brilliant and utterly repulsive. It came from the murex snail, millions upon millions of tiny marine creatures harvested along the rocky shores of Phoenicia. This wasn't a sustainable industry. It was an industrial-scale slaughter of mollusks. The process, if you can bear to imagine it, involved crushing these tiny shells and boiling the resulting slime in vast vats for days on end. The stench must have been an absolute horror show, a permanent, noxious cloud hanging over the cities of Tyre and Sidon, a miasma of rotting sea life and concentrated ammonia. But from that overwhelming stink, that sacrifice of life, emerged the drop of dye, the single chemical key to ancient power. To produce just 1 gram of this concentrated purple, thousands of snails had to be sacrificed. When you see depictions of Roman emperors draped in robes of full purple, understand that they are literally wearing the equivalent of an entire kingdom's annual output, paid for in blood, sweat, and silver. This incredible economic engine fueled the Phoenician expansion, but it also demanded new systems of logistics that the world had never seen. They couldn't just sail from Tyre to Egypt forever. To control the Mediterranean, they needed pit stops, trading posts, and secure havens far from the prying eyes of the land armies. This necessity birthed the Phoenician colonial network, a sprawling, invisible empire, built not on military garrisons, but on meticulously placed coastal emporia, trading stations that acted as stepping stones across the vast blue expanse. These were not colonies meant for conquest or permanent settlement in the Greek style. They were highly organized supply chains. They needed tin from the distant misty shores of Britain, silver from the sun-baked mines of Iberia, modern Spain, and safe harbors for their enormous fleet of rounded, sturdy merchant ships, the workhorses of the ancient economy. This drive pushed them into truly terrifying territory, the Western Mediterranean. They sailed past the terrifying Strait of Gibraltar, the very limits of the known world, guarded by the legendary Pillars of Hercules. Every other mariner believed that beyond those pillars lay certain doom, that the ocean was a churning void of unstoppable currents and sea monsters. But the Phoenicians, they sailed right through, guided by their proprietary knowledge of the stars and their unwavering greed for Iberian silver. They established Gades, Cadiz, the oldest continuously inhabited city in Europe, acting as the gateway to the Atlantic trade. This position was the ultimate secret weapon. If you wanted tin, if you wanted silver, if you wanted to trade anything valuable in the West, you had to go through the Phoenicians. They set the prices, they dictated the terms, and they ruthlessly protected their routes, sometimes resorting to sinking rival ships on sight and letting the ocean conceal their crimes. This control wasn't maintained by massive armies marching over land, which was the conventional power of the time. It was maintained by the invisible hand of supply and demand, and the constant threat of being cut off from essential resources. But their greatest export was not purple cloth or intricate glassware, it was the ultimate tool for trade, the alphabet. Think about this. Prior to the Phoenicians, writing was a cumbersome, elite skill used mostly by scribes and priests, requiring hundreds of complex cuneiform symbols or hieroglyphs. It took decades to master. But the Phoenicians, needing a fast, efficient way to record shipping manifests, contracts, and debt ledgers, stripped writing down to its bare, revolutionary essentials, a mere 22 phonetic symbols. This simple, elegant technology exploded across the ancient world. It was easy to learn, easy to teach, and it democratized information and, crucially, trade. The very language you are reading right now, the foundation of every major Western script, is a direct descendant of the Phoenician letters scratched onto papyrus centuries ago. They gave the world the means to communicate, but in doing so, they also gave the empires the means to organize against them. The wealthy, secretive coastal strip was now globally connected, financially dominant, and technologically superior. They had painted a colossal target on their backs, shimmering in the brilliant, unattainable hue of Tyrian purple. And that, my friends, meant the colossal, grinding armies of Assyria, the first great war machine built purely for conquest, were about to turn their hungry eyes toward the narrow strip of Canaan. The hungry eyes of Assyria were not metaphorical. They were the cold, calculating gaze of kings like Ashur-Nasir Paul II, men who measured success not in territory, but in severed heads and mountains of gold. When the Assyrian war machine rolled out of Mesopotamia, the earth truly trembled, a sound that carried across the deserts and slammed into the frail walls of Tyre and Sidon. These were not mere raiders. This was institutionalized, industrial-scale conquest, designed to crush the soul out of every nation they touched, and the rich Phoenician coast was the ultimate prize. The city-states of Phoenicia, Byblus, Sidon, Arwad, and the magnificent island fortress of Tyre looked at the approaching catastrophe and made a terrifyingly pragmatic decision, a choice that defined their survival for the next 2 centuries. They did not have the sheer manpower, the iron ore, or the relentless military culture needed to stand against the sheer brutality of the Assyrian chariots and their highly disciplined legions, which were armed with weapons forged in the fires of endless warfare. Instead of fighting, they would pay, turning their greatest asset, their incomprehensible maritime wealth, into a golden shield, hoping to deflect the storm of iron just long enough to continue their profitable existence. The sheer magnitude of the tribute demanded by the Sargonid dynasty of Assyria is almost impossible for us to comprehend today. It was a ransom paid in pure, refined terror, calculated down to the last ingot of silver and the last bolt of fabric. Every single year, massive silver-laden galleys would quietly leave the docks of Tyre and Sidon, heading east, filled with cedar logs, fine linen, and jars brimming with the legendary, heart-stoppingly expensive Tyrian purple dye. This wasn't just pocket change, it was the financial bloodletting of a nation, designed to keep the Assyrian boot off their necks, ensuring their fragile sovereignty remained intact, at least nominally, while the merchant fleet continued its work. But where did all this wealth actually come from? This inexhaustible supply of riches that allowed a few small cities to financially support the greatest empire the world had ever known. The secret lay in the foul, processing stench that perpetually hung over the Phoenician coastline, especially around Tyre, a smell that signaled the extraction of the most desired commodity in the entire ancient world: Tyrian purple, or murex dye. This was the true color of kings, a shade so deep and so permanent that its value sometimes exceeded its weight in gold, reserved exclusively for royalty, high priests, and the most elite generals who wished to display their divine power. The source was a tiny, unassuming sea snail, the Murex brandaris, harvested by the millions and thousands of tons, requiring an industrial scale of macabre labor to yield just a single gram of the purest pigment, a process utterly controlled by the Phoenicians. Think about that. It took over 10,000 snails, painstakingly gathered from the rocky seabed, to dye just the trim of a single Roman toga, a horrifying biological expenditure that fueled the entire Phoenician global economy and terrified every competitor. The workshops were gruesome, hellish places of work, where the snails were painstakingly crushed, the minuscule glands containing the precious fluid extracted, and then left to putrefy under the sun in massive clay vats, a weeks-long process of controlled decay that released the terrible odor that was the smell of money. This secrecy, this absolute exclusive control over the manufacturing and distribution process, made them untouchable in the marketplace, but it also painted a giant, purple target on their backs, making them a necessity that empires could not live without, but also desperately wanted to possess themselves. The constant, debilitating pressure from the Mesopotamian giants did something critical, however. It pushed the Phoenicians further out to sea, accelerating their colonization and exploration effort far beyond the familiar waters of the Levant. They needed new sources of tribute and new markets far from the immediate reach of Sargon's spies, and that meant plunging into the terrifying, unknown expanse of the Western Mediterranean, an act of sheer geographic defiance. This was the era where their greatest colonies truly flourished, creating strategic hubs like Utica, Lixus, Gades, modern Cadiz, and, most fatefully, the burgeoning power known as Carthage, each strategically placed to control key choke points of maritime commerce and resource extraction. These were not just temporary trading posts, they were sophisticated naval bases, resource centers, and financial institutions, extending the invisible, profitable hand of Phoenician economic dominance from Cyprus all the way to the legendary Pillars of Hercules and beyond, into the cold Atlantic. They were chasing the vital metal trade, the highly sought-after tin from the mysterious British Isles, the abundant silver from Spain, metals essential for forging the advanced iron weapons needed by the very Assyrian armies that were currently threatening to obliterate them. The Phoenician sailors were masters of deception, cloaking their voyages in profound secrecy, inventing navigational charts that were intentionally misleading, and swearing their captains to absolute silence under penalty of death, keeping their routes proprietary. If any rival ship, Greek, Egyptian, or Philistine, dared to follow them or inquire too closely about the true routes to the rich silver mines of Tartessus, the Phoenicians were brutal, unforgiving, and acted with deadly efficiency far from the eyes of land-based authority. Tales circulated in every port of enemy ships mysteriously disappearing in calm seas, or being deliberately sunk after being cleverly led into treacherous coastal shallows by seemingly helpful Phoenician guides who then vanished into the night. Their trade was a silent, lethal war fought not with legions but with knowledge and profound maritime skill, ensuring the secrets of the Atlantic remained locked away inside the heavily guarded hulls of their massive biremes, keeping the competition perpetually in the dark. But paying tribute only bought time. It did not purchase freedom, and soon enough the Assyrian appetite for Phoenician gold became entirely insatiable, eventually reaching a breaking point under the rule of the fearsome Shalmaneser V. When Tyre, weary of the endless, crushing financial demands, momentarily hesitated on a payment due to internal political strife, the terrifying response was immediate, crushing, and absolute, confirming that the Assyrians valued obedience more than money. The Assyrian king descended upon the coast, not merely to collect taxes, but to dismantle the entire Phoenician economic machine and seize the sources of their wealth forever, initiating one of the most famous and agonizing sieges of the ancient world. The great city of Tyre, a powerful fortress built upon an island just off the coast, suddenly found itself blockaded and cut off from all land-based water sources and vital supplies, facing the concentrated might of an empire determined to starve them into submission. This was the moment their incredible, worldwide maritime infrastructure truly paid off, as they attempted the impossible, sustaining a massive, besieged island city solely through open-sea resupply for 5 long years, a desperate, decade-defining dance against the King of Kings, proving that the true strength of the Phoenicians lay not on land, but in the relentless, terrifying open ocean. The gates of Tyre creaked open, not in surrender, but in a victory so bitter it tasted like salt in iron. Nebuchadnezzar's mighty army, the same force that had leveled Jerusalem and swallowed the Near East whole, was gone, retreating not because they failed to break the walls, but because the walls were ultimately irrelevant to the true power center of the Phoenicians. The mainland city, the old town, was bruised and scarred, but the island fortress remained impregnable, a floating citadel refusing to bow to the gods of land-based empires. They had bought their freedom with 5 years of unimaginable suffering, proving a terrifying principle: you cannot conquer the sea. This was the Golden Age, born of absolute terror. With the threat of Babylon temporarily receding, Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos threw every single resource they possessed into the water. Their triremes became faster, their hulls deeper, their compasses, or whatever arcane star charts they used, pointed definitively toward the setting sun and the rumored lands of unimaginable wealth. The Mediterranean was no longer a shared lake, it was a Phoenician highway, a watery monopoly guarded by silence and overwhelming naval expertise. They didn't just establish trading posts, they established strategic choke points, ensuring that any flow of goods from west to east had to pass through their invisible hands, paying a heavy toll. And what were they trading that justified this dangerous secrecy? Cedar was essential, yes, the strong, fragrant backbone of their fleet and the palaces of foreign kings. But the true engine of their wealth, the color of kings, was murex, Tyrian purple. This was not a commodity. It was liquid prestige, costing more than its weight in gold, sometimes more than silver itself. Imagine, a single robe dyed this color was enough to purchase a fleet of warships or fund an entire legion. The secret of its creation was guarded with vicious intensity. Thousands upon thousands of snails harvested from the seabed had to be crushed, a process so foul-smelling, so labor-intensive, that the very air around the dyeing vats in Sidon was noxious, a perfume of extreme wealth and power. This stench was the smell of global finance, a bloody, violet stain that signified supremacy. If you knew how to make it, you were safe. If you merely wore it, you were a target. The Phoenicians ensured that only they held the keys to this terrifying chemical process. But the vastness of the sea demanded more than just trade agreements. It demanded permanent settlement, the embedding of Phoenician influence deep into foreign soil. This was how they created the thalassocracy, a rule by sea. They weren't seeking conquest like the Assyrians, they sought control through commerce and cultural penetration. They ceded the coasts of North Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, and Iberia with miniature versions of Tyre, strategic outposts that served as rest stops, supply depots, and intelligence hubs. The most famous, the most ambitious, the one destined to inherit the entire Phoenician legacy and face Rome itself, was Karthatisht, or the New City, Carthage. Born decades earlier, Carthage now flourished, a jewel in the western Mediterranean, strategically placed to control the crucial Strait of Sicily and funnel the silver of Spain back toward the mother cities. Carthage was the future, a terrifyingly successful experiment in decentralized imperialism. Yet all the purple robes, all the cedar ships, all the silver ingots from Tartessos paled in comparison to the single greatest export they delivered to the world, a weapon more potent than any siege engine, a cargo that fundamentally rewrote the history of human communication, the Phoenician alphabet. For centuries, the empires surrounding them, Egypt, Mesopotamia, relied on complex, laborious systems, hieroglyphs demanding years of priestly study, or cuneiform requiring hundreds of symbols. These systems were designed to restrict knowledge, to keep power centralized in the hands of the educated elite. The Phoenicians, the ultimate pragmatists, needed something faster, something a merchant could scratch onto a clay shard or a piece of papyrus while calculating inventory or charting a course correction. They streamlined the cumbersome Proto-Semitic scripts, eliminating the need for vowels initially, creating 22 simple abstract consonants. It was elegantly simple, mathematically perfect, and brutally efficient. This wasn't just a communication tool. It was the democratization of knowledge. It allowed anyone, from a dock worker in Byblos to a farmer in Greece, to record transactions, to read laws, to document history. It was the intellectual foundation upon which Greek philosophy and Roman law would eventually be built. The irony was exquisite. The secretive masters of trade had unwittingly given the world the tool necessary to shatter their own monopoly on information. They traded their goods in exchange for silver, but they traded their alphabet in exchange for global influence that transcended physical borders and the transient rule of kings. This simple system of 22 strokes was their true, immortal legacy, quietly spreading like wildfire across every port their ships touched. They were the middlemen of civilization, transporting not just material goods, but the very DNA of future thought. But as their wealth grew and their alphabet made its way to the shores of Italy, a new, younger shadow began to stretch across the sea, a shadow that cared nothing for trade and everything for conquest. The West was stirring, and the Greeks were starting to ask dangerous questions about who controlled the waves. The West was stirring, and the Greeks were starting to ask dangerous questions about who controlled the waves. But the Greeks weren't just asking questions. They were building ships, long and fast, their ambitions mirroring the limitless horizons the Phoenicians claimed as their private domain. The vast Mediterranean suddenly felt smaller, tighter, and the shadow of the Minoan and Mycenaean past, though long gone, seemed to whisper warnings on the wind that the sea remembers its true masters. Tyre, the unassailable fortress, looked west and saw not empty water, but a hungry rival ready to tear down the carefully constructed facade of Phoenician mystery and geographic supremacy. The Phoenicians had perfected the art of strategic silence to a terrifying degree. Their sailing instructions were not written down in any public ledger or displayed on monumental tablets. They were oral traditions, fiercely guarded, often deliberately misleading, designed to make any ambitious imitator founder on the unseen currents and hidden rocks of the uncharted deep. Imagine the ancient mariners, trained from childhood to read the subtle shift in the water's color, the specific flight path of a particular seabird, or the unique smell of the air, knowing that revealing the path to the tin-rich coasts of Britannia or the silver mines of Iberia meant instant, devastating ruin to their empire of commerce. They needed an anchor, a failsafe, far from the endemic eastern chaos that threatened to wipe their narrow strip of civilization off the map with every passing year. And so, the greatest insurance policy in history was founded. Kart-Hadasht, the new city, Carthage, strategically placed on a stunningly defensible peninsula in modern-day Tunisia, controlling the narrowest choke point of the Western Mediterranean. This wasn't just another colony, a temporary trading post to offload excess goods. It was a mirror kingdom, a Western capital, destined by design and geography to inherit the entire, staggering mantle of the Phoenician sea power when the inevitable Eastern storm finally broke. Initially, Carthage was merely a staging post, a necessary hub for refueling and resupply before the terrifying journey into the unknown Atlantic. But its position, controlling the crucial narrows between Sicily and Africa, gave it a strategic stranglehold on all east-west traffic that was simply unavoidable. Every ship sailing between the Aegean world and the mysterious, resource-rich lands beyond the Pillars of Hercules had to pass through their vigilant, demanding gaze. This young city, founded perhaps around 814 BCE, started to grow with terrifying exponential speed, rapidly developing its own formidable fleets and an almost fanatical dedication to the old Tyrian gods, especially the terrible, demanding Baal Hammon, whose shadow would one day darken the entire Mediterranean. The true, secret source of their wealth, the legendary metal that armed the entire Bronze Age world, was tin. Without it, bronze could not be made, armies could not march, the tools of civilization would cease to function. The Phoenicians, and now the rising Carthaginians, guarded the route to the source, the Cassiterides, believed to be the British Isles or parts of Western Europe, with brutal, lethal efficiency. The journey was a masterpiece of clandestine navigation, sailing past the Strait of Gibraltar, the legendary Pillars of Hercules, which they claimed marked the definitive, final end of the habitable world, a place of dread and unimaginable peril. They deliberately manufactured and expertly disseminated myths of monstrous seas, boiling whirlpools, and colossal sea creatures that waded beyond the pillars, ensuring that the ambitious but geographically limited Greeks stayed within the familiar, relatively safe bounds of the Aegean. Any foreign ship, be it Greek or Iberian or Etruscan, attempting to follow a Phoenician galley beyond the strait was met not with negotiation or a warning shot, but with immediate, brutal, silent destruction. It was economic espionage enforced not by complicated treaties, but by swift ramming prow and the silent, cold drowning of every single sailor on board. The price of maintaining their global monopoly on the indispensable tin trade was measured in untold secrets and the lives of countless unwitting rivals who dared to stray too far west. Meanwhile, back in the motherland, the Phoenicians were facing intellectual competition from the very people they had unwittingly armed with the most powerful informational tool ever conceived, the alphabet. This simple, elegant system of 22 consonants, which allowed any common merchant, not just high priests or specialized royal scribes, to record complex transactions and maintain accurate ledgers, had been eagerly adopted and adapted by the burgeoning Greek city-states. But the Greeks did something absolutely revolutionary, a pivot that changed the course of human communication forever. They added vowels. This seemingly minor, technical addition transformed the Phoenician commercial script, a tool built for trade efficiency, into a flexible, lyrical instrument capable of recording epic poetry, complex philosophical arguments, democratic debate, and detailed historical records that sought to understand the very nature of existence. Suddenly, the narrative control shifted seismically. The Phoenicians used the alphabet for invoices and bills of lading, ensuring profit margins were met. The Greeks used it to write down Homer and codify the laws of Athens. It was the moment trade efficiency gave way to cultural permanence, and the Greeks began to define the terms of the Western world. But even as the Greeks flourished in the Aegean, A far more physical, terrifying threat solidified in the east, one that cared nothing for poetry or vowels: the Assyrian Empire. These were not subtle traders or careful diplomats. They were calculating, disciplined, machine-like conquerors who viewed the wealthy Phoenician cities purely as tax farms waiting to be harvested, places of immeasurable value to be squeezed dry until their cedar forests were stripped bare and their gold treasuries emptied. The sheer, overwhelming power of Assyria, under iron-willed kings like Shalmaneser III and Tiglath-Pileser III, was about to crash down on the fragile, exposed coast of Canaan, demanding tribute, hostages, total, humiliating submission, and the very ships of the Tyrian fleet to use in their own campaigns against Egypt. The cost of wearing Tyrian purple, of possessing the finest cedar, of controlling the world's most profound wealth, was suddenly due, and the mighty Assyrian war machine was coming with chilling efficiency to collect. Tyre, the legendary island city, believed its mighty, seven-layered walls and its legendary mastery of the sea would save it from the rampaging Assyrian infantry. But history rarely respects arrogance in the face of absolute power. The shadow of the siege, the smell of burning cedar, and the horrifying, rhythmic sound of 1,000 Assyrian war drums were already echoing across the narrow sea channel that separated the seemingly invincible city from the merciless mainland. The clock was ticking down to the first great existential test of the Phoenician world power, a test that would either confirm their status as untouchable masters or reduce them to vassals bowing before the terrifying, bearded kings of the Mesopotamian plains. The test had arrived, not as a whisper on the wind, but as the thundering march of 1,000 ironclad boots. The Mesopotamian plains had finally spilled their terrifying occupants onto the sun-drenched beaches of Phoenicia. This was the moment of truth for Tyre, for Sidon, for every city that dared to call itself the master of the sea. The sheer weight of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, an unstoppable, organized killing machine led by kings whose names echoed dread across the entire Fertile Crescent, was now pressing down upon the narrow, vulnerable coast of Canaan. The price of peace was galactic, an annual tribute so enormous it was designed not just to extract wealth, but to crush the very spirit of independence, demanding literal tons of fine silver, vast quantities of precious cedar wood, and the irreplaceable, blood-drenched secret of their purple dye, a tribute so heavy it threatened to empty the entire Mediterranean economy. Did the Phoenicians, masters of global finance, fight? Absolutely not. Not openly. They were merchants, not warmongers, and their armies were built of disciplined sailors, not siege engineers capable of repelling the full might of Nineveh. To meet the Assyrian hammer head-on was certain, instantaneous suicide. Instead, they played the long game, a terrifying high-stakes negotiation where every delay costs lives, but bought precious, essential time and sovereignty. They used their untouchable global wealth, the silver flowing in from the mythical mines of Tartessos and the gold dug up in the uncharted coastlines of Africa, to pay the tribute, effectively buying off the terrifying Assyrian war machine with money sourced from 3 continents away. This brilliant, calculated move kept the main Assyrian armies focused on more immediate, land-based rivals, allowing Tyre and Sidon to maintain their trade routes, the deep arteries that pumped the lifeblood of their empire, even while technically subservient vassals. But even this strategy, financed by the deep pockets of the Sea Kings, had a fatal, terrifying flaw. a point where the massive weight of the Assyrian king's ego and endless hunger for domination would inevitably break the carefully constructed barrier of gold and smooth diplomacy. The flaw was simple. The Assyrians didn't just want the gold. They wanted to see them grovel. They demanded absolute control of the harbor, the imposition of Assyrian governors who would rule with an iron fist from within the city walls, and the total surrender of the purple dye monopoly, the single greatest source of Phoenician power and mystique. This was where the final, definitive line was drawn. The Phoenicians could pay money, but they would never surrender the keys to their oceanic kingdom, the secrets of their ancient sacred craft. The resistance started subtly, slowed payments, deliberate confusion in the intricate accounting scrolls, and the misplacing of crucial documentation, driving the Assyrian tax collectors insane with bureaucratic delay and frustration. But when King Lulai of Tyre finally, dramatically, and publicly refused the full, humiliating terms, denouncing the Assyrian envoys in his own court, the terrifying, inevitable hammer fell. The king of Assyria, enraged by this microscopic defiance from a tiny city perched on a coastal rock, mobilized the full, terrifying might of Nineveh's vast, logistical siege apparatus, demanding total destruction. The great city of Tyre, the crown jewel and most powerful fortress of Phoenicia, was split into two vital parts: the bustling old city on the mainland and the impregnable island city half a mile offshore, protected by massive 150-foot walls and the unpredictable, merciless, deep Mediterranean Sea. The mainland city, bustling with markets, temples, and shipyards, was immediately put to the torch by the invading forces. It was a terrifying sacrifice, a brutal, strategic offering made to the Assyrian fury to buy time, but it was nothing compared to the true, untouchable heart of Tyre. King Luli and the elite, wealthy population of the city immediately retreated to the island fortress, carrying every ounce of gold, their sacred records, and the secret mollusks used to make the precious purple. The Assyrians watched from the shore, their unparalleled land power rendered utterly useless, humiliatingly neutralized by the short, lapping waves of the sea. They tried everything. They gathered vassal ships from the newly conquered coastal cities of Sidon and Byblos, demanding that Phoenicians fight their own kin, forming a desperate proxy navy to starve the island. But the Tyrian fleet, sleek, bronze-beaked, and infinitely faster, was the undisputed master of this coastline, smashing the hastily assembled enemy ships back to the shore. The ensuing conflict was not a battle, but a legendary test of sheer, terrifying endurance that lasted an unbelievable 13 years, sometimes measured at 10 years, depending on which terrified Assyrian scribe was counting the seasons. This was not a quick siege. This was a decade-long war of attrition fought between an unstoppable land force and an unmovable, floating naval fortress. The Assyrians, masters of engineering, built massive siege moles out into the water, monumental piles of stone, timber, and webble, trying desperately to bridge the gap, only for the brutal, punishing winter storms and the swift Tyrian triremes to smash their construction efforts night after night, reducing weeks of labor to underwater rubble. How did Tyre survive such an impossible duration? Through the sea itself. While the Assyrians controlled the sightlines from the shore, the Tyrian ships, masters of stealth and celestial navigation, ran the blockade, sneaking out under the cover of the absolute Mediterranean night, sailing south to their allies in Egypt or west to the safety of Cyprus to resupply the starving island populace. Every barrel of fresh water, every sack of precious grain, was an act of extreme, desperate bravery, paid for in unimaginable amounts of gold, and often in the blood of brave sailors who refused to yield. This resilience, this terrifying ability to persist where any other city would have starved and crumbled, cemented the Phoenician legend. They were not just rich, they were utterly unbreakable when cornered, the ultimate survivors. When the Assyrian king finally, furiously retreated, exhausted by the logistical nightmare of maintaining a siege for over a decade and distracted by new, massive uprisings in Babylon, Tyre had won the agonizing battle, but lost the profound geopolitical war. They had proved they could not be conquered by siege, but they were bled white financially and demographically. Their landholdings were decimated, their mainland population was scattered, and their sister cities, Byblos and Sidon, had learned a terrifying, definitive lesson. Immediate submission meant guaranteed survival. The powerful, centralized coastal empire of the past was dissolving into a collection of nervous, fractured city-states, each trying desperately to negotiate its own survival with the terrifying Mesopotamian giants who controlled the land. And as the eastern heartland of Phoenicia began to flicker and dim under the shadow of Nineveh, the ultimate terrifying and necessary pivot began. The wealth, the ancient knowledge, the true future of the Phoenician world was already sailing far, far west to a newly built, aggressively expanding city on the coast of North Africa, Kart Hadasht, Carthage. The secret masters of the world were packing their bags and preparing for their second, grander, and ultimately more tragic act, far away from the iron grasp of the Eastern kingdoms. The world thought they had merely moved, but the Phoenicians were not simply relocating, they were leveling up. The shadow of Tyre may have faded in the east, but a new, more terrifying sun was rising over the western sea, blazing from the shores of North Africa. They called this city Hadasht, the new city, but history would remember it by the name that made emperors tremble: Carthage. This wasn't just a trading post. It was a fortress, a choke point, and the most magnificent feat of engineering the Mediterranean had yet seen, a monument to commercial ruthlessness. Positioned perfectly on a peninsula jutting into the vital shipping lanes between the continents, Carthage controlled the gateway to the west, demanding tribute from every vessel that dared to pass. Its prosperity was immediate, overwhelming, and terrifying to behold, built upon the ruins of its mother city's exhaustion. Its double harbor system was the stuff of legend and the envy of every admiral in the ancient world. A vast, rectangular commercial port teeming with the world's riches, connected by a narrow, fortified channel to a perfectly circular, secretive inner basin reserved exclusively for their war fleet. This inner sanctuary was the beating heart of their naval supremacy, the ultimate defense against prying eyes and jealous rivals. The circular military harbor, known simply as the Kothan, was surrounded by massive defensive walls and housed 220 ship sheds, each one capable of sheltering the monstrous triremes and quinqueremes that would enforce their monopolistic rule. At the very center stood the Admiral's Tower, a vantage point so absolute that the entire coastline could be monitored, ensuring absolute secrecy regarding their movements, their destinations, and their strategies. If you sailed too close to Carthage without explicit written permission, your ship simply disappeared, swallowed by the waves or dragged into the dark hold of a Punic galley. No longer were they merely loyal subjects beholden to the whims of faraway Assyrian tax collectors or the shaky treaties of the mainland. They were Punic now, a distinct, fiercely independent power forged in the crucible of trade, ambition, and survival. Their new empire was not a collection of trading posts, but a true territorial dominion, stretching tentacles across the vital islands of the central Mediterranean. Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica became agonizing battlegrounds, essential stepping stones for projecting Carthaginian power and eliminating any nascent competition from the increasingly aggressive Greek colonizers. They carved out spheres of influence with cold, calculated precision, using both staggering wealth and brutal military force to secure their grip. But the true, terrifying source of Carthaginian invincibility lay not in the Mediterranean, but thousands of miles away, in their iron grip on the most precious, vital commodity of the Bronze Age: tin. Without tin, you had no bronze. Without bronze, you had no meaningful weapons, tools, or industrial capacity. And the only source of industrial-scale tin lay in the mythological, fog-shrouded lands far beyond the Pillars of Hercules, in the cold, unforgiving waters off the coast of Britain, the edge of the known world. The Phoenicians were the only ones who knew the route, a terrifying secret guarded with a religious fervor and punishable by immediate, brutal execution for any soul who dared to speak of it. A Carthaginian captain, if shadowed by a Greek or Etruscan ship attempting to trace their mysterious course, was under standing orders to deliberately scuttle his own vessel, sacrificing his crew, his fortune, and himself, rather than risk divulging the sacred path to the legendary Tin Islands. Imagine the scene. A desperate, overloaded merchant galley, silently taking on water in the middle of a vast, empty ocean, sinking with all hands just to preserve the industrial dominance of a city 1,000 miles away. That was the absolute, deadly price of admission to the Punic trade network, and it made Carthage untouchable. To the south, their control extended deep into the African interior, securing vital agricultural lands that fed the burgeoning population and allowed them to withstand any siege. To the west, Spain, Iberia, was their second great monumental prize. Rich beyond imagining, its mountains literally bled silver, a metal that fueled the entire Mediterranean economy and allowed Carthage to buy up the loyalty of half the ancient world. They established massive, industrialized mining operations, controlling the entire infrastructure, demanding absolute obedience from the local tribes with ruthless, swift efficiency. This vast, resource-rich dominion required protection, and here the Punic state pioneered a terrifying new military model: the massive, professional armies of hired mercenaries. Iberians, Gauls, Numidians, the fiercest, most unpredictable warriors of the known world, were paid staggering sums in Carthaginian silver to fight and die for the masters of the sea, creating a war machine that struck fear into every established kingdom. But behind the shining marble, the gleaming silver, and the technological marvels of the Chthon, there was a darkness that would forever haunt the Carthaginian legacy, amplified 1,000 times by their later Roman rivals. The religious practices of the Punic elite were, to the outsiders, terrifying and unforgivable. "They are cruel, they are unnatural," the Greeks and Romans whispered, using the fear of the Moloch to justify future atrocities. They deserve to be crushed, erased from the face of the earth. Carthage, the invincible trading machine, stood poised at the zenith of its power, the richest city in the world. But absolute control means inevitable confrontation. Having escaped the suffocating grip of the Eastern empires, the Phoenicians now found themselves face to face with the rising tide of Western ambition. The Greeks of Syracuse, hungry for the riches of Sicily, looked across the narrow Strait of Messina with pure avarice. And far across the Tyrrhenian Sea, a small, ambitious settlement named Rome was watching, learning, and waiting. The stage was now set for the clash of titans, a conflict that would decide not just the fate of Carthage, but the entire direction of Western civilization itself in an explosion of blood and iron.